Good morning. It is your professor, and this morning we get to talk about Bill Clinton and a rapidly changing world. This is a fun lecture because it's not my favorite, so I didn't say that thing again. But anyway, this is a fun lecture because it really gives us a chance to take a look at one, the United States' rising presence in the Middle East, and two, the changing face of the Democratic Party, and three, something called globalization, which is an economic phenomenon that ends up being a social phenomenon and an environmental phenomenon and a justice phenomenon, and we just get to talk about it, and it's a really exciting thing. So basically, we are looking at a changing world, and we are looking at that world post-Reagan. So if we've spent a while talking about the Reagan Revolution, now is the time that we get to talk about the way that the world changed because of what Reagan had done. And that's the direction that this lecture is going. And it never changes on the first slide. It's okay, I figured it out. Things that you need to know. What were the consequences of communism's collapse? Right, global communism collapse. Did I not mention that? We're going to talk about that. What is globalization? How does globalization change daily life? These are sort of in the wrong order. Why was Bill Clinton appealing? And what happened to conservatism when Bill Clinton got elected? This is the direction that we're going. Because I want you to understand how we move from that much of a Republican to a different Republican to Bill Clinton. How do we get from Reagan to Clinton? What are the consequences of that for like average Americans, right? What are some of the issues internally and externally that are going on for the American public? What are some of the economic challenges of the 1990s? 1990s are like in, by the way, like straight bangs and like chokers and shit. Yeah, that stuff's back in. So apparently you need to know about Bill Clinton because the 90s are in. Doc Martens. What else is in? High-waisted jeans. Those prints in belly shirt, like paisley belly shirts. That shit's in. Yeah. So, like, I think if it's fashion 90s, it should also be history 90s. So you should know what happened in the 1990s. Bam! I'm just trying to keep you hip. Cool. Let's get started. So if you remember where we ended last time, we ended with the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra affair plagued Reagan for the last part of his presidency. But ultimately, he was never impeached. He was acquitted of all responsibility, basically. And it sort of got swept under the rug. People were really appalled, but the people who were really appalled were people that were generally appalled with Reagan. You didn't have a massive lashback against the Reagan administration because of the Iran-Contra affair. In fact, it would really be analyzed later how remarkable this affair was. So it's really interesting because it's a moment when the presidency did really betray the American people, or arguably somebody high up betrayed the American people. But the presidency doesn't take a lot of flack for it. It really is not seen as Reagan's fault because his popularity was just so immense. He was just such a big figure that couldn't take him down. After all, he was a movie star and he presided over a massive period of economic expansion for American business. And folks are like, no, that guy's awesome. We like that guy. But the world was changing, and the world was changing during the Iran-Contra affair, and it was changing over the years that Reagan's presidency was wrapping up. So what I want to talk about are a couple of global changes that represented the collapse of global communism, particularly the collapse of the Soviet Union, which ultimately dismantles in 1991, but was ongoing for a while. So if you remember in 1885, Mikhail Gorbachev takes over. I'm probably butchering that name because I've never actually heard it pronounced. Mikhail? Anyway, it's Gorbachev. Takes over in 1985. And Gorbachev is really much more progressive as a leader for the Soviet Union. And he wants to see the Soviet Union be slightly more democratic. He wants to see them engage in world powers more. And this is really why Reagan could negotiate abroad, right? He wanted to be that incredible Cold Warrior, but you've got someone different to deal with, and Gorbachev is actually like, yeah, you don't need to fight me, I'm cool, bro. So you already start to see the Soviet Union becoming less Soviet Union-y already, in 1985. And there are plenty of people that are not happy with that in the Soviet Union, but it is nonetheless something that is actually going on. But a couple of things really accelerate that decline of the Soviet Union. Basically, a lot of the countries that were under the control of the Soviet Union had been for a long time advocating for more autonomy. The elections they believed were rigged. The Soviet Union didn't give enough smaller support to their smaller allies. They didn't give financial or military aid. And those smaller allies that the Soviet Union had really bullied into being part of it were like, okay, this alliance isn't actually what we want. We want independence. And a lot of things really changed the way that those smaller countries started to think about independence. One of those was actually the collapse of a nuclear plant in Ukraine. So in Chernobyl, there was a massive accident and a nuclear fallout happened from this explosion and caused crazy damage. There's actually a bunch of Netflix shows about it, and if you're interested in it, there's a ton of information about it. I don't go into depth into the nuclear explosion at Chernobyl, but it was important for research on nuclear weaponry, and it was important for study of the effects of radiation, particularly on the environment. But the reason that I'm bringing it into our lecture today is because people in Ukraine were like, dude, this would not have happened if you had actually supported our economy and had regulations or oversight on businesses or had some hand in the economy. But you didn't, and now we had a nuclear explosion. Great job, Soviet Union. So there's a lot of backlash against the Soviet Union because something like this could have happened. And now Ukraine's the only place where this really, something this big happened, but other countries were like, yeah, that's not fair. And so most of the time, with the exception of one, this withdrawal from the Soviet Union was actually quite peaceful. You didn't actually have outright armed rebellion. That's not true in one place. But for the vast majority of these smaller nations kind of drifting away from the Soviet Union, they were pretty diplomatic. And of course, one of the consequences of Gorbachev being less Soviet Union-y than other people is that he's not pursuing wrapping up those countries and being very totalitarian about it. So they are able to drift away in a different way. So most of these are coming out of the Soviet Union without violence, and that's leading to the collapse of what was seen as that red tide. It is rolling back, kind of on its own. There's one exception to that nonviolent rolling back of communism, and that would be in China. In 1989, looking at the rest of the world, looking at the consequences of communism, and very much so feeling like they did not have political autonomy or free speech, the citizens of China stood up to the communist government in a very famous, historically important moment in Tiananmen Square. And the image on the right here has become, actually I don't know if the right is the same for you. The tanks. Look at the tanks. That image circulated throughout the globe and became very, what's the word I'm looking for? Iconic about what happened in Tiananmen Square in China. You see this man standing in front of the tanks, basically facing down a row of tanks as a peaceful demonstrator. And peaceful demonstrators were really at the core of the protests in Tiananmen Square. A lot of children, a lot of college kids, there were some children, a lot of academics in particular who felt like they didn't have freedom of speech, and they were ruthlessly mowed down by the Chinese military. The fact that so many people were killed by this, and the numbers of people who were killed are not actually known. China disputes them heavily. There were at least several hundred protesters killed. But the rest of the world was like, China, the fuck? You can't do that. This is exactly the problem with communism. So China is widely condemned. It's George Bush who's president at the time, and he actually doesn't take a ton of action against China. He's just like, that's not cool, bro. And they have to negotiate that relationship afterwards. There were a lot of people in Congress that wanted harsher sanctions against China, economic sanctions in particular, but Bush didn't pass those. So China is one of the places where communism is alive and well and thriving in the 1990s. And this is what thriving looked like. However, communism ends its reign in Germany in 1989, which is, incidentally, the year that I was born. The Berlin Wall fell. And the Berlin Wall was the wall that differentiated between East and West Germany, and it was the borderline, considered the borderline in Germany between communism and capitalism. And that wall fell for a variety of reasons, but mostly because Gorbachev didn't really care too much anymore to enforce it, right? And maintaining a wall like that required serious government and military intervention. And when that wall fell, basically that marked the reunification of Germany as a more Western country. There were some concessions made to communism, like some trade agreements, but negotiating a new unified Germany would be part of what the United Nations worked on in the 1990s. And it would come in eventually to NATO, and it would eventually really be part of the Western world. So that rise of a modern Germany happens in this moment as well. By 1991, Gorbachev is not at all popular. Gorbachev is seen as the guy that basically let Russia collapse. And everyone's like, what is wrong with you? We elected you to do internal reforms, but we didn't want to be this weak externally. Things are kind of a disaster. There's a failed coup against him. But it becomes very, very clear that Gorbachev will not be able to keep the Soviet Union together. By 1992, he resigns. And in his place comes this dude named Boris Yeltsin. And under Boris Yeltsin, the Soviet Union would essentially collapse, and people would understand that it had collapsed, and they would try to build Russia for Russia. But the Soviet Union, for what it was gone by 1992. So this dude, when he ran for office in 1988, he was looking at a radically different world than Reagan had looked at. He took office amidst the collapse of global communism. It hadn't happened yet. It was happening, but it wasn't like an international war. Except for Tiananmen Square in 1989, most of this was fairly peaceful. So he takes office amidst this controversy. We see in the election of 1988 that Bush is fairly popular. That's because Reagan was crazy popular, and Bush was his vice president. So by and large, Bush is like, hey, we've been prosperous. We're going to be more prosperous. I'm going to do that thing that we did. And everyone is like, okay, cool, we can buy that. Except that you do see that there's more of a Democratic presence than there had been in the election of 1984, and that's definitely worth mentioning. This dude, though, Dukakis, is interesting because Democrats realized that they couldn't run the kind of leftist person that they had had before. People like Lyndon B. Johnson, they just weren't going to cut it anymore. You couldn't have the leftist of the leftist. Dukakis was a lot more middle ground. And so it's an election which the Democrats really learn, in order to beat a Republican president, you're going to have to be really middle ground. This election for Benson is actually, is a faithless elector in West Virginia. So that was trying to make a political comment about the Electoral College. Not particularly important for the overall election. But so the election really shows us that A, Republicans are still super popular, despite the questionable choices of Reagan and his, I would say throughout his whole presidency, but you might really just say with the Iran-Contra affair. Despite that, the Republicans remain very popular, and Bush is symbolic of what Reagan was. So you can see in this election that they do very, very well, despite the fact that Bush would face a really different world. Before we go on, let's check out some of those campaign ads. C-SPAN saves an archive.
4 years ago. Here are a few of the ads voters saw in that presidential race. They are part of the Political Commercial Archive collection at the University of Oklahoma.
A crime quiz. Which candidate for president gave weekend passes to first-degree murderers who were not even eligible for parole? Michael Dukakis. Who vetoed mandatory jail sentences for drug dealers? Michael Dukakis. Who opposes capital punishment in all cases and even vetoed the death penalty for cop killers? Michael Dukakis. Which candidate for president can you really count on to be tough on crime? George Bush. Experienced leadership for America's future.
Leadership.
Okay, we're transitioning to a Dukakis commercial here, but keep in mind the kinds of things that Bush is trying to argue for then. Remember Reagan's war on drugs? He's saying that shit is working. Our tough on crime is working. We need to remain tough on crime. And Dukakis does not do that. And there is some wrapped up fear of immigrants. There's some definitely some concern about keeping policing drug-infested populations, which is how Reagan would have put it. And there is also an increasing conversation about the death penalty.
It's meeting the tough problems head on. That's how Mike Dukakis fought crime in Massachusetts. In the last 4 years, he's put 20% more cops on the street and 5 times as many drug offenders behind bars. Leadership. It's getting real results. Crime down in Massachusetts by 13% and the lowest homicide rate of any industrial state. Look at the record. That's leadership. Leadership
Sorry.
that's on your side. Michael Dukakis for president. Let's take charge of America's future.
Okay, so what's interesting there is that Dukakis does not go, hey, dude, the war on drugs is racist. Or, hey, dude, we need to stop being so, we need to not put people in jail all the time and we need to actually put them through rehab. No, he's not doing that. We don't have the far left in this. He's much more of a centrist. And even then, he's not getting a lot of the votes because it's just a very Republican moment in American history.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Jimmy did well.
So you can see the sensationalist fears, right? But also that this is the really central issue in this campaign, is that relying on, when I say that he was relying on Reagan's legacy, part of that is relying on Reagan's tough stance on crime.
In high school, good grades, good in sports, a popular kid. He got accepted to college, but his family couldn't afford tuition. And there weren't any scholarships. There are a lot of families like Jimmy's. Mike Dukakis wants to help. His college opportunity plan says that if a kid like Jimmy has the grades for college, America should find a way to send him. Mike Dukakis, a president for the 90s.
That was really traditional male hair in the 90s. I just want you to know that, okay? But yeah, you can also start to see this focus on more programs than the federal government is creating. Okay, there's a lot more. I'm going to leave that. You can go check that out later if you want that, but we are going to have to get back to our PowerPoint. If we were in class, I'd have you watch those and analyze them and fight with each other, and that would be really cool, but we don't get to do that. Boom. Oh, crapola. Okay. I'm totally a good professor who has their shit together and is a complete professional. Anyway, so the world that Bush took over when he came into office, because obviously he won, when he came into office in 1988 was just really different. Basically, when Reagan came into office, Reagan rode into the presidential office on a shining white horse. Everybody loved him. He was literally a movie star. He actually got his start in Hollywood, right? He promised all of these things. He represented the coming together of these different branches of republicanism, and he faced a world in which communism was relatively strong, and they needed a strong stance against communism. And he faced a world that was in an economic slump, but that was Reagan. Bush didn't face that. Bush faced a world in which the national economy was actually going pretty well. So while Reagan said, we're going to save the economy, Bush was like, I guess we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Yeah, we'll do that. And generally speaking, that doesn't win votes or support as much as rescue, right? But the consequences of Reaganomics were increasingly becoming clear. While the national economy was going well, by the markers of business, as I talked about in the last election, the markers of the individual people were not actually going well. So businesses are thriving, and that's great. But that trickle-down thing wasn't necessarily working, and actually we have massive discrepancies between the wealthy and the poor. We've got increasing class stratification, and or $220 billion left in debt, because you can't cut taxes that much and have, and even if you cut social programs, but grow the military and don't have a federal income. So it's just not really working. We have great overall markers, but we are significantly in debt, and that ends up being a significant problem. So Bush is facing a world where the consequences of Republican fiscal policy are beginning to show, and people are getting really disassociated with it. But also, Reagan had a bad guy. He had international communism. But increasingly, after Bush takes office, the bad guy kind of goes away. And everybody loves a hero, right? Everybody loves a guy that can fight the bad guy. But Bush is like, well, who am I supposed to fight when, for the first time, communism is dying? It's dying on its own. So Bush doesn't have the same kind of world to talk about or to speak to or to engage with that Reagan had. And that ends up meaning that he's a pretty unpopular president. He's not massively unpopular. He would not be the most unpopular. But everybody's just kind of like, we had a guy on a white horse, and you're just kind of like, I don't know, a guy with a spear who doesn't have anything to do. So that's cool. So Bush is just not the kind of figure that Reagan was, and that's a disappointment for Republicans. George Bush's main accomplishments were not domestic. George Bush's main accomplishments were abroad. And personally, I think that he is actually kind of underrated as a negotiator. He did a lot to negotiate for the country's place in foreign affairs. He was negotiating with Gorbachev, and he had good relations with Gorbachev, but then right away he adapted and he was like, okay, Yeltsin, cool. And both of them worked very closely towards disarmament. So he did manage to get a couple of things accomplished in that. He also did engage with force in a couple of places, though. He tried to negotiate, particularly in Panama. So remember the United States' long-standing engagement in Latin America, but he ended up sending forces in Panama to oust a leader that was not friendly to the United States, Somoza. So he did engage in a couple of very aggressive affairs abroad, but these were not necessarily as popular as other presidents had been. In fact, most people thought that he pretty much mismanaged Panama, but he was really good at the diplomatic connections that he made. Probably the biggest foreign event during his presidency was the Gulf War. And the Gulf War is important to our story because it signifies a more complicated relationship with the United States in the Middle East. Now, in order to understand the Gulf War, you have to go back to what we talked about in Reagan's presidency, and that's part of the reason why we covered it. Remember that the United States and Afghanistan did not get along originally because Afghanistan was like buddy-buddy with the Soviet Union, and obviously the United States is like, we don't do that shit. But the United States ended up supporting Afghanistan in their war with, I just totally said that wrong, Iraq, in their war with Iran. Oh my gosh, Afghanistan comes into this, but not yet. So the United States is supporting Iraq in their war with Iran, and that means a friendly relationship with Saddam Hussein, temporarily. That relationship ends up changing. So rather than stumble over the names anymore, I'm going to show you this very helpful video. I've given you two videos here. One is the 3-minute version, and the other is the 12-minute version. You should probably watch the 12-minute version if you're confused, because this one moves very, very quickly, but I'll try to pause it and clarify some things. Okay. Also, it might block me for copyright infringement, but we will see.
During the 1980s, Iraq fought a long and costly war against Iran. So Saddam Hussein had to try and rebuild the nation, but faced...
In that war, the United States supported Iraq. They actually had a pretty good relationship with Saddam Hussein because they did not like Iran. And sometimes you got to get in bed with your enemy in order to defeat your bigger enemy. So, U.S., good relationship with Iran in the mid-1980s, with Iraq in the mid-1980s.
A series of challenges. He feared an Arabian anti-Iraqi coalition was being formed when his rival, Assad of Syria, held talks with Kuwait and Egypt. He refused to pay back debts to his neighbors and accused Kuwait of side drilling into...
So during that war, in the Iraq-Iran war, Iraq had built up massive amounts of debts to the United States, but also to lots of areas in the Middle East that could not afford to not have those debts repaid. And so Saddam Hussein was like, please, can I just not pay that thing? And everyone was like, no, that's not going to work. And one of the countries that ends up being a pretty big issue here was Kuwait. So Kuwait's a little, tiny little thing on the edge of Iraq, and they have really good oil resources. But OPEC had established some rules about how much oil you could drill. But Kuwait was poor, and they wanted more oil, so they kept drilling oil, probably above the limit. Saddam Hussein was like, I can't get money anywhere else, so I'm going to go after you because you're the one making all the money, and you're depressing oil prices for the rest of us, and that's a problem.
To the Romanian oil field which lay in Iraq. He also accused Kuwait of breaking the oil production quotas implemented by OPEC, and this reduced the price of oil and cost Iraq billions. But
which they did do. They did break that.
Kuwait had long been claimed by Iraq because it was part of the Ottoman province of Basra, and Saddam began threatening military action against Kuwait in 1990, saying they were acting on behalf of the US. The Americans had supported Hussein during his war with Iran, but Iraq had been allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and supported the PLO in their fight against Israel. Nevertheless, as Saddam
Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Hussein moved troops near to Kuwait, the Americans held the Jeddah talks with him in July 1990.
Okay, so what's happening in this context is that Saddam Hussein is going after Kuwait. And Kuwait's a little neighbor, and Saddam Hussein has like a shit ton crazy huge military because he had that shit ton crazy huge military in the Iraq-Iran war, and he did not disarm it. So it's one of the largest militaries in the world. It's not a weak military. Kuwait's like a teeny little bitty country, and they're like, the hell, we can't do anything about that. And so the United States is like, Hussein, chillax. Kuwait's just a little buddy. We can resolve this diplomatically. And it orders Kuwait to pay them some money, but not enough money. And Hussein is not particularly receptive to negotiations because he needs cash. Again, this is actually one of the areas where Bush thrived. Bush did facilitate a lot of those communications.
During the talk, they agreed that Kuwait should pay compensation for the use of the Rumelia oil fields. However, Kuwait only offered $9 billion out of the promised $10 billion. Hussein used this as a cause for war and invaded 2 days later. The Iraqi army, which hadn't fully demobilized, was one of the largest in the world with over 1 million troops, thousands of tanks and hundreds of planes. Kuwait's army of a few thousand couldn't put up much resistance, so in 2 days the country was under Iraqi control. The Kuwaiti government and thousands of refugees fled to Saudi Arabia, while Saddam put his cousin Ali Hassan al-Majid, or Chemical Ali, in control of Kuwait.
Okay, so the people who were in Kuwait go to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia does not like Iraq. Iraq takes over Kuwait and sets up shop there.
Iraqi troops then deployed to the Saudi border, so the US, on August the 7th, launched Operation Desert Shield.
So, I'm sorry, I keep pausing this, but this is going really fast and it does need some clarification. So as the Soviet Union continues to go further and further, they're like, well, why stop at Kuwait? Because Saudi Arabia looks pretty good too, and they've got nice oil, and we've already got our military here. And the United States is at that point like, no, not cool. And the United States and the UN were working in close tandem, and Bush is like, I think that we're going to have to invade. And the UN is like, that makes sense, but Bush does get approval from Congress to
Aircraft carriers, artillery and 500,000 troops were sent to Saudi Arabia to deter Saddam from attacking and capturing the oil-rich border regions. Meanwhile, the UN condemned the invasions and put strict sanctions on Iraq. But the Arab League was split because some nations like Libya and Sudan and even the PLO backed Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein gave a list of demands including Israeli withdrawal from Arab land, Iraqi access to the Persian Gulf and even a favourable trade deal with the US. Plus he also appeared on TV with Western hostages. But the US was unwilling to negotiate, so
that's not really well said. The United States was not willing to acquiesce to his demands. The United States was at the negotiating table. They were not willing to meet what Saddam Hussein wanted because Saddam Hussein was, first off, like a pretty terrible guy, like massive human rights violations, and actually just a generally kind of evil person. But also because the requests that he made were like absolutely ridiculous, and he was being really crazy aggressive to allies of the United States in the Middle East, and because he had multiple Western hostages, and the United States is like, we're not gonna negotiate like that.
So the UN gave Iraq until mid-January 1991 to pull out of Kuwait or be forced out.
So they set a deadline. That deadline was, you gotta get out of Kuwait by this point in time.
President Bush spent this time making a coalition, and this coalition of over 30 nations included Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Syria and Egypt, most of Western Europe, and even countries like Japan and Senegal.
And again, one of the places where Bush thrived, right? Like he was able to get a bunch of places involved in this by saying, we need to stop Saddam Hussein. This is not cool. We need to be a united front against this. That was a lot of diplomatic work on Bush's part.
Deadline for withdrawal passed, so on January 17th, Operation Desert Storm was launched. A massive air campaign dropped over 100,000 bombs, destroying a great deal of Iraq's air force, communication facilities and Scud missile launchers. However, Iraq responded by launching Scud missiles into Israel, hoping Israel would retaliate and declare war, and Hussein would then get the backing of other Arab nations. But the US kept Israel from responding, so Iraq tried to...
That, again, was a major, major diplomatic accomplishment. To prevent Israel from responding to that was to prevent, like, all-out warfare in the Middle East. So give Bush credit where it's due.
Move into Saudi Arabia in late January. At the border town of Khafji, the Iraqis were quickly driven out by the coalition army backed by air support. But the coalition waited until mid-February before countering. In the meantime, special forces were sent behind enemy lines to scout out Iraqi troop movements, while Iraqi scouts were specifically targeted. Plus, the coalition tanks were far superior to the Iraqis' Soviet and locally produced tanks, so they quickly captured Iraq's defensive bunkers on the border. And just before troops moved into Iraq, a huge artillery barrage destroyed over 20 Iraqi artillery battalions. Then on the 15th of February, the Americans feigned an attack on Wadi al-Batin. This tricked the Iraqis into reinforcing their position in the south. The coalition instead swept through the now relatively undefended deserts of southern Iraq, while mainly Arab troops held the border of Kuwait. The coalition did face some opposition on the 26th and 27th of February, like large tank battles at 73 Easting, al-Basuya and Medina Ridge. But the Iraqis proved incapable of stopping the advance, so Saddam ordered a full retreat.
This was a very quick, very successful war on the part of the US and the UN troops that accompanied them.
Although Marines still had to fight to gain control of the Kuwaiti International Airport, the emir was restored to power, and he quickly began to persecute suspected Iraqi sympathizers. Plus, as the Iraqis retreated, their convoy was heavily bombed, and this road was dubbed the Highway of Death. But the retreating Iraqis did set fire to hundreds of oil wells before signing a ceasefire on the 28th. The coalition chose not to advance on Baghdad because they thought a rebellion would topple Saddam. There were some rebellions, notably the Kurds in the north and the Shia groups and demoralized soldiers in the south. But the promised aid didn't arrive and the rebellions were crushed. And despite continuous sanctions, Saddam Hussein remained in power until the American second invasion in 2003.
Okay, so legacies of that war then become particularly important, and there are two that I want to emphasize. Here we go. Why am I being an idiot? Ooh, what if I did that? And then every time that I was, oh my God. There we go. Cripes, why did that take me a year? Anyway, a couple of legacies to that I want to comment on. First off, absolutely deteriorated relationship with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein continues to be a fairly brutal dictator, but the United States is absolutely anti-Saddam Hussein. So anti-Saddam Hussein at this point that there would be several other wars in the Middle East. Largely, the Gulf War, especially Operation Desert Storm, was like super popular because it was quick, it was decisive, and the United States was morally in the right in repelling somebody who was taking over advantage of another country. It is going back on an ally, and that was a little bit weird, but this was a fairly popular war. It was not popular enough to keep Bush in office, because really the genius of this war was in the diplomatic negotiations that attempted to avoid it unsuccessfully. Bush was actually really famous for, or not famous for, what he should be famous for, were the two negotiations that he mentioned. Oh, I forgot, I'm really sorry. The other major consequence of this war was that the United States would remain stationed in Saudi Arabia. So United States troops hang out in Saudi Arabia and they don't actually go home after the war is over. That causes a significant amount of an issue because those troops are like hanging out by holy sites and probably doing things that Americans do that make devout Muslims uncomfortable, and so that would end up being some of the tensions later. important also. We'll get back to that when we talk about the other Bush. Okay, George Bush Sr., though, did establish two important main negotiations. One in Madrid. Those negotiations in Madrid were to find peace in the Middle East. Spoiler alert, they didn't work, but they were still important in that the United States said this is a goal that we have and this is something that we're going to work on. What was more successful, not during Bush's presidency, but would eventually be, were the negotiations with Canada and Mexico to establish a free trade agreement within their borders. Both of these failed, but both of these were important conversations that Bush opened. He was still opening them, though, in the election of 1992. In the election of 1992, Republicans ran Bush again, but Democrats finally managed to find a candidate that was center enough to counter the Republican message. And this was a very close election. So I want to play for you some of the campaign ads. Before I do that, though, I want to note that Bush ran on his own legacy, right? I'm going to support this world. And Clinton was like, the world is different. We have to do different things. He was also widely popular because he was a Southerner and he was like a cool guy and he played the saxophone and he was really appealing to people when Bush's kind of broader political persona was not. So let's take a look.
Our look at presidential campaign ads continues. Up next, we turn our attention to the Clinton-Gore Campaign Committee. The Washington, D.C. firm of Greer, Margolis, Mitchell, Grunwald and Associates is putting together the ad campaign for the Democratic Party ticket.
Remember, and if you elect me president, you will be better off 4 years from now than you are today.
Average family income down $1,600 in 2 years.
You will be better off 4 years from now than you are today.
Family health care costs up $1,800 in 4 years.
You will be better off 4 years.
The second biggest tax increase in history.
If you elect me president, you will be better off 4 years from now than you are today.
Well, it's 4 years later. How you doing?
Okay, that's really trippy. But basically this is Bush didn't fulfill his campaign promises to the average American. And largely, he didn't. He did a lot abroad, but that doesn't appeal to most people in America. We tend to be disconnected from foreign affairs. We tend to not pay as much attention to that. And Bush had done a lot of things that alienated people. You know, he really didn't support social justice activism, right? After Reagan, the left was really angry and really wanted to see more. And at least Reagan was really conciliatory to white feminism. But Bush was not. Bush totally ignored domestic policies on the left, totally ignored them. And in fact, one of his advisors had a speech where he just called everybody leftist hippies, and it was awful. And so the Republican Party's not liked by common people. And add to that the fact that it is an economy that is starting to slip. So this ad is speaking to both of those things.
Bill Clinton's economic plan, endorsed by over 600 economists, including 10 Nobel Prize winners, as the best hope for reviving the nation's economy. More than 400 of America's most respected business leaders say the Clinton plan will create jobs. A panel of independent experts convened by Time magazine concludes that Clinton's plan has the best solutions to our economic problems. And now even the author of Ross Perot's plan has endorsed Bill Clinton for president. Let's get our economy moving again. 1988.
We will be able to produce 30 million jobs in the next 8 years.
Under George Bush, more private sector jobs have been lost than have been created.
And I am an environmentalist.
The Sierra Club says Bush allowed his administration to, quote, gut clean air rules.
I want to be the education president.
George Bush tried to cut college aid for families making over $20,000 a year.
I want a kinder and gentler.
We can't afford 4 more years.
I was born in a little town called Hope, Arkansas, 3 months after my father died. I remember that old 2-story house where I lived with my grandparents. They had very limited incomes. It was in 1963 that I went to Washington and met President Kennedy at the Boys Nation program. And I remember just thinking what an incredible country this was, that somebody like me, had no money or anything, would be given the opportunity to meet the president. That's when I decided that I could really do public service because I cared so much about people. I worked my way through law school with part-time jobs, anything I could find. And after I graduated, I really didn't care about making a lot of money. I just wanted to go home and see if I could make a difference. We've worked hard in education and healthcare to create jobs, and we've made real progress. Now it's exhilarating to me to think that as president, I could help to change all our people's lives for the better and bring hope back to the American dream.
I actually hadn't noticed the reliance on the word hope in there, which is interesting looking at Obama's campaign. But anyway, you can see the criticisms of Bush. You can see he didn't fulfill his campaign promises. And you can see, we want to get back to American policy. And that's basically the campaign that oh my good Lord, Clinton ran on. Those are really different presidents. Really, really different presidents. Okay. Oh my God. Anyway, so Bill Clinton took office, and Bill Clinton was very much so a center Democrat. He campaigned on this idea that he was going to focus on America, this idea that he was going to bring the economy back in America. And it was very much so, I'm not a Republican president, but it was also very much so not, I'm on the far left. It's not going to be that kind of presidency. Much, much, much more of a moderate. And you can see the ways that he's trying to appeal in particular to the lower classes in America, and he does that successfully. So you can see in his campaign he gets a significant amount of both the South and the North and the West, and that's a really remarkable thing, mostly because he's a moderate. Okay. Clinton picked up where Bush left off in the North American Free Trade Agreement, and he actually did manage to successfully negotiate it. The idea behind NAFTA was to allow for profitable trade between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and that's because millions of dollars cross those borders every day, and the idea was basically, look, let's establish a free zone of trade. Not everything's free, but we don't have taxes between these areas. We don't have import taxes or export taxes. And it didn't do that immediately. It gave that time to adjust, but that was the long-term goal of NAFTA. The consequences of that would be very interesting, though, and people worried about the potential impact to labor and the potential impact to the environment. We'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about what globalization is, but people worried about that, and so this only got passed with some protections for labor and for the environment. Those protections for labor and for the environment are precisely what angered Republicans in this last year. So NAFTA has never been like a neutral thing. Both Democrats and Republicans generally want a free trade agreement, but what those specifications are going to be is highly questionable. Trump got rid of the existing NAFTA agreement a few years ago and renegotiated his own called the USMC, United States Mexico Canada Agreement, and that agreement is significantly different in those particulars about protections for American businesses, and there are no environmental protections in that, and so that's a politically contentious thing. Clinton did manage to do a lot in his presidency, and you can see in the things that he does this negotiation between what is considered democratic leftist politics and ameliorist politics, right? Very much so moving towards the right. So in one sense, like awesome sauce, Clinton was totally a Democrat leftist. But in another sense, he actually did a really good job managing to make himself appealing to more moderates and especially to conservatives. For instance, he did raise taxes on the wealthy and he cut taxes for the poor. But in doing so, he actually managed to get rid of the national deficit, which nobody wants. It's not like anybody's like, hey, I love the deficit. Let's definitely have a deficit. That was true at one point of American history when a deficit would represent a stronger federal government, but that's not true now. Like generally people don't want to be in debt. And so this understanding that you'd be able to get out of that hole that was caused by Reagan is really, really good. But you could only do that when you raise taxes on the wealthy, because raising taxes a little bit on the wealthy gets you a lot more money than raising taxes a lot on the poor, because we have a really stratified economic society. So Clinton manages to do that. It doesn't make wealthy people super happy, but it does make poorer people happy, and it does make everybody happy that the budget is actually balanced. We get into the green in Clinton. Clinton also tried to do a couple of things he never managed to do. He tried to create a nationalized version of healthcare, and this is also something that was really taken on by his wife, Hillary Clinton. And nationalized healthcare under the Clintons would not have looked the same as it looked in European countries. It would have been based on HMOs. And it was actually fairly conservative. It was not a true nationalized healthcare plan, but it was a start towards that. The medical industry was like, no, that's not happening. And so because of lobbies from hospitals, from doctors, from pharmaceutical companies, that didn't end up happening. And it's not really part of the legacy of the Clintons that we talk about, but I find it really interesting that he managed to do that even as a moderate Democrat, right? And we talk about that as being super radical. Clinton also negotiated welfare exactly like a moderate would. He abolished some but instituted others. So the Aid for Families with Dependent Children, the AFDC, was probably the most controversial part of welfare policy. And that was a policy that gave outright aid to families that had children under 18 and were either unemployed or underemployed. That was the biggest thing that people accused people of being welfare mothers on. Clinton outright got rid of it. Instead, he replaced it with TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And TANF there were very clear rules on how long you could be on it. There were very clear rules about what your household had to be structured like. And there were very heavy incentives for working alongside it. So TANF was very, very different. It was much more heavily regulated, and it gave the states a lot more power to either grant or deny welfare claims. This is not as good for people, right, who need the welfare, but it is definitely good for states, and it means that less people are on welfare, which means less spending, and so the deficit, again, is able to be conquered. Clinton has a really interesting position in the history of liberalism. In one sense, he did a ton. He appointed a lot of women and minority people to positions of power, including, most importantly, I would argue, Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is all around a badass of badasses of badassery, and having her on the Supreme Court was really, really helpful. Clinton also did a couple of other things for women that were great in particular. Particularly the Federal Protections Against Domestic Violence. What was that act called? I'm going to stumble on my tongue here. Come on. Federal Protections for... VAWA, Violence Against Women Act. Got it. Which is in the 1990s. And it basically allows the federal government to financially support institutions that are giving aid to women in domestic violence situations. But by and large, doing things for ladies is that's like diet liberalism. Like that's as I'm not saying it's not good. It's wonderful, right? But most people aren't opposed to doing things for ladies. They're much more opposed to doing things for Black people, to doing things for Hispanic people, and to doing things for gay people. So in some ways, Clinton was awesome because he did appoint a lot of judges, but people really accused him of that being a tokenism thing. You just appoint these people and hope that they do the work, but you're not doing the work. That's the accusation. Clinton also has a much more complicated legacy when it comes to the homosexual community. He was the one who instituted Don't Ask, Don't Tell is what this policy became called in the military forces. It basically said if you're gay and you're in the military, you can't be kicked out for it if you don't tell anybody. Nobody's allowed to ask you. So in other words, just don't talk about that and it'll be okay. That is as middle ground as it gets. Because on the one hand, it's not like everyone's getting fired from the military for being gay. But on the other hand, you shouldn't have to hide your identity in order to not get fired, right? That seems pretty basic. So this would not be overturned until Obama, but became the policy for homosexuality in the military. He also had a controversial legacy when it comes to addressing the AIDS epidemic, which was really ramping up in the 1990s. AIDS being the immunocompromised virus and really affects disproportionately gay communities for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to get into here. Because of that, it's seen as like a gay disease, like you only have it if you're gay, which is not true. But that's how it's seen, and so it's a political issue to address it. Clinton does pass a law that's meant to help people who have it, but it's not actually enforced, and it's not a very strong law. So again, kind of walking a middle ground. And the AIDS crisis is like growing, like it's a real issue. Thousands upon thousands of people are dying every year in the United States because of that. So it's becoming and it's gotten better, but it's becoming a particular issue in the late 80s and early 90s. So we've got some progress, right? We've got progress in that Clinton appoints people to positions, that Clinton doesn't institute outright bans, but we also have conservatism. And I think what's really interesting about Clinton is that he is the middle ground, but it's interesting to look at the consequences of the middle ground. So one of the things that happened under Clinton's presidency is that, sure, like women and minorities were appointed to positions of power. This is awesome. Sure, policies are not outright hostile. This is also awesome. We like this. But on the other hand, when you cut funding for social services, you disproportionately hurt people that have, because of historical structures of power, been made more vulnerable. So when you cut, for instance, welfare, you're hurting the black community more than the white community because the black community needs to rely on welfare more than the white community because of the historical legacy of racism, right? So there's some give and take there. Yes, there's progress, but there's also conservatism in that he's not willing to be as left as Democrats would want the party to be. Clinton also has a little bit of a complicated legacy abroad. Basically, Clinton's approach to international politics was, we're not going to touch that. And there's a place for that. Clinton did not want to be involved. He said, the United States has been far too involved for far too long. That's causing a huge military. We need to cut, I don't think he ever explicitly said cut the military budget, but not spending as much money on the military did help him to cut that deficit. But that had a couple important consequences because there were a lot of things going on during the Clinton administration that people really criticized him for not getting involved in. He's like, communism doesn't exist anymore. We don't have to worry about it. Well, sort of, except that there are massive human rights abuses in other places in the world. So while Jimmy Carter had been really big on tackling rights issues, Clinton is hands off, including there's a massive genocide in Rwanda. There's a huge war in Yugoslavia. And Clinton's like, we don't have any responsibility. And I mean, arguably as the wealthiest nation on the planet, do we have responsibility to protect people who are suffering from human rights abuses? A lot of people said yes. In fact, Congress really pushed him to intervene and he didn't want to. So he was, I guess I would call it aggressively non-aggressive, which presents its own conundrums. Of course, what Clinton ended up being known for was the affair that he had with Monica Lewinsky. Monica Lewinsky was a young intern. She came to the White House when she was 21 in an unpaid internship and ended up having an affair with Bill Clinton that lasted about 2 years. People did not know of the affair as it was ongoing, but it came out in a separate trial. That trial was not actually for having an affair with Monica Lewinsky. That trial was for sexual harassment of somebody else. But it came out in that trial that he was having an affair, and he denied having that affair. And when it was found out that he actually did have that affair, the nation was like, you lied to us. And they impeached him for lying before the court. So we are going to watch a couple of things related to that. First off, oh yeah, this is just fun. Everybody loves Clinton. This is the joke of this Family Guy. Because he, balances these things.
Mr. President, I need to have a word with you. Well, you certainly are very persuasive.
So I've been told. Hey, you want to give me that cigar? I'm ready to smoke it now.
That's a joke.
What the hell was I thinking? I don't know what came over me. Oh, God, what am I gonna...
Notice because she's here humping you!
Peter, look, I know this looks bad, and I feel horrible, and I know nothing I could say to you could possibly justify why I slept with Bill, except... I mean, Peter, the man presided over the longest economic expansion in U.S. history, and he reduced the percentage of Americans on welfare to its lowest level in 33 years.
35 years.
35 years, Peter.
That's the joke, right? That he's, universally liked. But anyway. Here is the New York Times with a timeline of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And this is a pretty good one. I believe if I play this, I'm going to get in trouble for copyright, so I won't go the whole way through it. But it sort of talks about the timeline of their relationship, and then when it comes out that he had lied, and then because this is the trial in which he's accused of sexual assault, which he's not found guilty for, but he is in that trial. He lies about his relationship, and that comes out later. I do want to play for you the speech that he gave when he was accused of this.
This was worthy of the nation's highest office, Ronald Reagan's speech. 12 years later, on this day in 1998, a scandal of sex and lies marked a low point for the White House.
It was the day President Bill Clinton said words that would follow him and his wife for years to come. Scott Pelley reports.
Tonight, Monica Lewinsky's attorneys tell us that she has told prosecutors all she knows. They describe what they call a complete account of her relationship with President Clinton. But that account was given over the telephone today and was not written down. Prosecutors are still trying to decide whether they will offer immunity. This new threat came on the same day that the president finally rallied to his own defense.
The president had been silent 3 days. His lawyers wanted it that way. But the political damage was rising much too fast. Today, drawn and bleary-eyed, Mr. Clinton joined the battle to save his presidency.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
He turned his back on questions as...
And there's really no question about the fact that that was outright a lie. He lied. He lied to the American people. And he admitted lying later. But ultimately, Clinton was impeached on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice, but he did not reach the 2/3 necessary in order to be removed from office. And he served out the remainder of his second presidential term after being impeached, but successfully moving through that impeachment in the way that Trump is also serving out that term. So impeachment with Clinton was not, I don't even know how to use these terms. It was successful in the fact that he was impeached, right? That there was a trial, but it did not remove him from office. Clinton's presidency, probably the biggest economic force that he had to deal with, and the force that many presidents after him would need to deal with, is called globalization. So I want to take a second to define what globalization is for you and talk about it as such, because this is the economic force that is changing the world during Clinton. And it has to do with economics, but it also has to do with technology and politics and social beliefs and social justice movements, and it's a really complicated phenomenon. But I have a couple of things for you. Here is the thing that I really recommend that you watch. This is an explanation of what, oh, I also have this link, you can watch this later. It's Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton reflecting on the Lewinsky affair. I'm not gonna play that for you. This is a basic explanation of what globalization is and why it happened. I'm going to tell you that, but this video can be very helpful, but I will most definitely get in trouble for plagiarism. Yes, and copyright mostly, if I play this for you. So I'm not gonna do that, so go check that out. But instead, let me tell you basically what it is. Globalization is an economic process in which the globe becomes smaller. If you were in my previous class, when we talked about the market revolution was this moment when communication and technology changed the way that people interacted, such that distances shrank, right? It was easier to transcend distance. Think about this as the global market revolution. Suddenly, in an age of the internet, especially, but also in terms of greater transportation technologies and communication technologies, and other kinds of technology, it becomes easier to say, make something in China and buy it in the United States. It becomes easier for a company to set up shop in India. It becomes easier, in other words, for what would normally have been a difficult supply chain globally to be easy globally. It was possible, in other words, in fact, it was economically beneficial for countries to set up shop in other places, for wealthy countries to set up shop for businesses in certain places and sell those goods where they were wealthy. So it's this ability then, it's both a coming together, right, in the condensing of the world, but it is also wealthy countries taking advantage of different economic rates in different places to get an economic advantage. So that there are a lot of things that are globalized, right? Things that you make in a factory are globalized. Shoes, clothes, electronics, particularly phones. Things that are dangerous and difficult to produce or require a lot of labor are some of the first things to be industrialized, like textiles, because you can get labor cheaper abroad. Someone will work for a smaller wage in China than they will in the United States. So goods are the first things to be commercialized. And we have a good relationship with China, at least a functional one at this point in time. And so there is that connection, right? It's not just that, though. It's also food, food that can grow in certain parts of the world. I mean, we are still beholden to environmental limits on what we can do in certain places. So food is also globalized. Ideas. With goods come ideas. I mean, it's books, it's the Hello Kitty doll, it's TY Beanie Babies, it's cultural ideas, right? But it's also weaponry, and it's also technology. This is how you make a phone. This is how you make an assault rifle. So there are weapons, there are technology, there are ideas that are being circulated because of the circulation of goods. And labor. Multiple kinds of labor. We typically think about factory workers first, and this is certainly true and probably the most common. If Nike wants to make shoes and set up a shop somewhere where labor is cheaper, then labor is becoming globalized. But that's not the only thing. There's also intellectuals. There's increasing competition for smart people throughout the globe, and so you've got more study abroad programs and exchange programs because countries are vying for the services of smart people. That also becomes globalized. And there's a thriving sex trade. This is the dirtier underside of globalization. Two is that with easier communication and technology, with the dark web, there is the sale of children and women and people that we wouldn't necessarily want to be commodities are put into this system. There are major consequences to globalization. On the one hand, globalization is awesome. Like better communication between countries, there can be a lot more, and that can serve as the basis of diplomatic connections, right? Goods are cheaper in general for people in first world countries anyway. Goods are certainly more widely available, and these can be really awesome things. But globalization is essentially capitalism re a global world in the active destruction of communism, and that means that we've got the consequences that come with capitalist development. First off, we have stratification between what we now call the first, second, and third world. Like, which countries are developed enough to take advantage of this? Which countries are the ones that are setting up shop in other places? To be able to benefit as a company from cheaper labor somewhere else is a privilege, and you can think of it very much so in the same way that companies benefit from labor on their own soil, except that these workers that can be taken advantage of are easily forgotten because they're not seen by activists. So there can be massive labor and human rights violations that take place within within the process of globalization and are not addressed as rapidly as labor and human rights violations that, I didn't fix this PowerPoint. That happen, I will fix this before I post it online, that happen within the country, right? There is also the growth of international social justice movements like feminism and labor rights. There's also environmental disaster, and there's disproportionate environmental disaster. So most of the thing that causes environmental consequences are massive factory production. That factory production moving abroad means that the United States' environment doesn't get as destroyed as other kinds of environments. Also, the very nature of shipping things is environmentally destructive, and so there's that consequence as well. I am really excited about the consequences on food. So if we had time in our in-person class, this is something that I would spend time talking on. The way that our diet changes with globalization. One really interesting example of this is quinoa. Like, nobody ate quinoa before, right? But quinoa is a super cheap grain in Africa. It's easily grown in Africa, and it's what most people are sustaining themselves on. When Americans found out about it as a superfood, suddenly it became super popular. The consequence of that is that people in Africa can grow quinoa for a lot of money, but also they're starving because they don't have the quinoa anymore, and there's not a lot of food production other than that. So there are really interesting consequences to this. Food is a really great example. Globalization has also led to a global obesity epidemic, particularly because of the globalization of fast food restaurants. It's also led to a global increase in meat eating, which is also contributing to environmental destruction because we have access to meat in a way that it won't spoil before it gets where it's going. So I've got a lot of interesting things for you to check out. I won't harp on it because that would annoy you, but also food and cows and quinoa and globalization, and like, that's my jam. So that's what I have for you today. I encourage you to think about these questions, and I am out. Nice work, people.